Hey y'all, welcome back to episode 3 of the Shit Your Lawyer Says podcast. We're back another week, another concept or phrase. I know you're just getting so used to listening to my beautiful voice every week. I'm happy you're here. This week, we're going to be talking about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. I don't know. I'm going to consider that a phrase. NDA isn't really a word, it's an acronym. Generally, that's how you hear it referred to, though. I don't know about y'all, but I work in the startup community mostly, startup technology, and you hear NDA, and the term NDA, the actual documents of the NDA thrown around all over the place. People pass out NDAs like candy at events before they talk to investors, before they present somewhere, every situation you can think of. So we're going to talk about non-disclosure agreements, what they are, what needs to be included, are they enforceable, how do we know, all of that fun type of stuff, and then also how do you apply it to your business. So if you're interested in learning more, stick around, join us for a bit.
Welcome to the Shit Your Lawyer Says podcast, where we demystify the legal jargon you hear every day and explain it so you can actually understand it. Recording in Dallas, Texas, here's your host, Attorney Jessica Vittorio.
Hey y'all, and welcome back. Like I said, it's episode 3 of the Shit Your Lawyer Says podcast. What an exciting time to be alive, y'all. I mean, really, we made it to episode 3. And I'm saying we because, you know, we're going on this journey together. This is an exciting adventure that we're taking together. I wonder sometimes, I actually wondered that this week while I was recording this podcast, at what point I'm going to start to feel like an experienced podcaster. I'm going to tell you that point is definitely not 3 episodes in. There's going to come a point, hopefully, when I'll just crank them out, you know? I will be so experienced. It'll be great. And we'll get to that point together. But just bear with me until then. Either way, like the intro said, my name is Jessica Vittorio. I'm an attorney based in Dallas, Texas. If you haven't tuned in before, thank you for listening. As the intro told you, this week we're talking about NDAs, non-disclosure agreements. I would put a significant amount of money on the fact that you have either handed out a non-disclosure at some point, signed a non-disclosure, or interacted with a non-disclosure, maybe saw one crumpled up on the sidewalk and threw it into the recycling bin for someone else who got frustrated with it and threw it on the ground. I don't know, but I would put a lot of money on the fact that you've interacted with one before. So this week we're going to talk about the same stuff we always talk about, you know? What makes them valid? How do you use them? What's a real life situation where you see them? And we'll go from there. So before we get started, I just want to do some weekly friendly reminders. First of all, engage with us on social media. If you don't already follow us on social media, check us out: Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, Shit Your Lawyer Says. You can also feel free to shoot an email over to shityourlawyersays@gmail.com. I just want to take a second and say I have been very pleasantly surprised with the social media response, not just how engaged y'all have been, but also just the fact that it's been really positive. Y'all, I was worried. You don't know me like that, but I can be a very anxious person, and I was worried about putting this stuff onto the internet. Because the internet is a scary place for a lot of reasons, but it's especially scary and intimidating when you put something new out there and you don't know how people are going to respond. But y'all have been awesome. So please keep engaging on social media. I love to hear comments, feedback, what y'all are thinking, etc. And also, if you're enjoying the podcast, please share. I don't know what platform specifically you're listening on, but we're on YouTube, Stitcher, TuneIn, Google Play, Blueberry, our own site, all of that stuff. So feel free to find us. Hopefully, iTunes and Spotify are pending. We'll get up there eventually. But for now, that's where you can find us. And be sure to share us. If you need a link to something and you don't have it, shoot me an email, send me a message on social media, and I'm happy to send that link along. But I think y'all are awesome, and I would love to have more of you to engage with. So be sure to share us with your friends, colleagues, whoever you think needs to hear about us. Also, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn if you want. I had some people ask me about that, if it was okay to connect with me on LinkedIn. Go for it. It's 90% podcast at this point. Half the time I update is the podcast. So sure, I'm happy to connect with you. Jessica Vittorio, attorney in Dallas. But yeah, keep in touch. I love to hear from y'all. So that being said, we're going to get into the fun disclaimers, which is the ones I say every week that you're going to get tired of hearing. I know I get tired of saying it, to be fair, but I know, you know too, the second I don't say it, I'm going to get a comment that is in relation to this. So I'm just going to put a friendly reminder out there that none of this is meant to be specific legal advice. It's all meant to provide some general education so you have a better understanding of the context and the concept, and hopefully you can apply that to something going on in your life. But if you have a really specific situation, if you have specific questions that maybe I'm not answering here, reach out to an attorney, and I'm sure they would be happy to help you. Reach out to me, reach out to another attorney, reach out to someone who spent a couple years learning about this stuff professionally, and I'm sure they'd be happy to help you. Okay, so let's talk for a second about some context about an NDA. Like I said, NDA is just an acronym for non-disclosure agreement. A non-disclosure agreement generally includes not only provisions related to the disclosure, it's going to be a long episode if I can't say this word, not only related to the disclosure of certain information, but also to the use of that information. So just so you have some context, because I know people had asked for that after the first episode, generally when you see a non-disclosure agreement, it can either be a standalone document, it can be a provision in a bigger contract, but you'll see first thing generally some definition of what the confidential information is, and it will be followed with a paragraph or two that sounds something like this. From time to time, the disclosing party may disclose confidential information to the receiving party. The receiving party will A, limit disclosure of any confidential information, B, advise its representatives of the proprietary nature of the confidential information, C, keep all confidential information strictly confidential, and D, do not disclose any confidential information received by it to any third parties. To be fair, that is not an excerpt out of any of my clients' non-disclosure agreements. That's just a general template example of a non-disclosure so that if you aren't familiar with them, you have some context as to what one sounds like, the types of language that you'll generally see, and hopefully you can think back to a situation where you may have encountered one in the past as we move forward and talk about the legality of them and what is generally / actually included in them. Okay, so now that you have a little bit of context into what a non-disclosure sounds like, at least in terms of language, so you have something to work with, let's step back for a second and talk about the 30,000 foot view of non-disclosure agreements. And before we get into that, I do want to preface this by saying that non-disclosure agreements are kind of a hot topic right now. They can be a touchy subject depending on what context you're talking about them in. And there will be, and we'll see this when we come back to the case study at the end, there will be some examples where, especially in the past 5 years, we've seen public backlash on non-disclosure agreements because they've been misused. And not even necessarily misused, they've been used for their intended purpose, but they've been abused by people in positions of power, be it bosses or people who have done negative things and they don't want it to get out into the media, maybe things that people should know, they want to make sure they don't get out. So I fully recognize that we're dealing with a hot topic here. But like we've said in other scenarios, it's not a political podcast. I'm not telling you to go out and use NDAs for negative reasons. I prefer to use the good side of, I want to make a Force comment, like Star Wars use the Force, and I'm just not cool enough to know how to pull that off. So imagine that I input in here some sort of really cool analogy to using the Force in a positive way instead of a negative way, and that I'm cool enough to pull that off. But yes, so that being said, we recognize and accept that this is kind of a controversial topic and these do potentially have controversial uses. But just so you have some background on what they are, like I said, at the 30,000 foot level, a non-disclosure agreement is simply just a contract through which two or more parties agree not to disclose information covered by the agreement. And, that sounds very simple on its face. It gets a little more tricky because we get into that definition of covered by the agreement, which means what is covered, what isn't covered, how have we defined that information. Also, not to disclose information, as we said in the beginning, that can include not just disclosure, but also use of the information. But really, how these are used in most business scenarios are for some reason, either I need you as an advisor, as a contractor to provide some sort of service. There's some sort of relationship between us that requires us to exchange information. And some of that information is confidential and important to me, and I don't want that information to get out. Maybe I don't want it to get out because it is important to my business and it's being kept as a trade secret. Maybe I don't want it to get out because I am not ready to release that information to the public. It's related to a product still in development. There's 1,000,001 reasons why you may not want that information to be public, but that's what an NDA does, is it protects information from A, being disclosed, and B, only being used for very specific, tailored reasons. So when we get in, like we are in a second, going to get into the nuts and bolts of what is included in a non-disclosure, keep in mind that really these are simple documents at the heart of them. That doesn't mean they don't get complicated, but at the heart of what we're trying to do, it's a very simple concept. Like I said previously, we're not dealing with complex abstract legal theories here. So I think that's important to keep in mind as we go forward. So let's quickly talk about structure of a non-disclosure agreement. Now that we have a better understanding of the context, we know a little bit about what they're supposed to do on a basic level. Like we saw or heard in your case in that definition of non-disclosure agreement, what it does is the parties agree not to disclose information covered by the agreement. So in terms of structure, like we said in context, one of the first things you're going to run into on any non-disclosure agreement, non-disclosure provision, is a definition of confidential information or proprietary information, whatever the word you may be using in your particular NDA is, some definition so we know what is covered by the agreement itself. And this is really the hinge that the entire agreement falls on, right? Because it's all about what we're defining and what is included in that definition. This is an important part. I know in a lot of documents, non-attorneys' instincts are just to skip over the definitions because they can be really boring. And they are really boring. I'm going to tell you that right now. They're going to be really boring. That's why I do my job and my clients don't want to do my job. But the definition is arguably the most important part of a non-disclosure because it doesn't matter to me really what I can do or not do with the information. That's pretty cut and dry. What I care about is what information can I tell and not tell. So maybe it's 50-50. I'll take that back. Maybe it's 50-50 between the actual disclosure provision, but the definition is definitely carrying its weight here more than in a lot of other provisions or types of agreements that we may talk about. So pay attention to the definition. A general definition is going to sound something like, let me pull up an example for you. For the purposes of this agreement, confidential information means any data, information, etc. that is proprietary to the disclosing party and not generally known to the public, whether in tangible or intangible form, etc. And this is where you'll input the specifics. For example, if you're dealing with a contractor and they have access to social media passwords, if you're dealing with an engineer and they have access to research and development plans or tests that have been done, all of that sort of stuff is going to be covered, and you're going to want to make sure that that's covered in your definition of information. Also, like we just saw in that example, you'll generally see some sort of comment related to the fact that it has to be information not generally known to the public. And that's kind of the caveat to all of these is once the information becomes known to the public, as long as it's not through any fault of one of the signing parties, then our entire definition of confidential information kind of bursts in the air like a little bubble. Once it becomes public information, it's inherently no longer confidential. So that's an important thing to be on the lookout in your definition of confidential information. But like I said, really, this is where the majority of your tailoring for non-disclosure is going to come in, because this is where you hit at the heart of protecting the specific information that you are seeking to protect, that you need to protect from a business standpoint. Following the definition, you'll generally see two types of subsequent paragraphs. One has to deal with disclosure and one deals with use. Now, each of these paragraphs are laying out the rules of the game, right? If the definition really tells us the game that we're playing, what information are we playing with, the disclosure and use provisions tell us what the rules are. How can I use that information? How can I disclose that information? Or how can I not use that information or not disclose that information? This is where you'll find the provisions that say you can't post it to social media, you can't use it for your personal gain, you can't use it in any way not related to a service being provided to the owner of the information. All of those things are included. And like I said earlier, I quickly mentioned it, it's important to recognize the distinction between disclosure and use, because they sound similar, but they have very different purposes. So disclosure is making it publicly available or otherwise disclosing it to individuals who may not have access to it. So I post it on my Facebook page. I give it to a competing company. I hand that information over to someone who otherwise did not have access to it. Use does not necessarily even require me to disclose the information to anyone else. For example, if I'm a contractor and I have access to your client list, your technical specs, something along those lines, then I may not have to disclose that information to anyone else to use that information inappropriately. For example, to create a competing company, to create my own product, to reverse engineer a product, something along those lines. So the difference between disclosure and use is important because they sound similar, but do have different purposes within the agreement itself. But really, they both function in the same way in that they provide the rules that we're working by. And so it's important to look at not only the definition, so we know the information that is protected, but also the disclosure and use provisions so that we have at least a bullet point list of what we can and cannot do, because that's the most important thing that you should be walking away with when you're looking at an NDA. Quickly, I just want to mention the different types of non-disclosure agreements that you may hear mentioned: unilateral, bilateral, multilateral. These are less specific in terms of actual substance than other types of provisions you may see. Unilateral just means one party is giving away confidential information. So for example, a contractor or service provider agreement, I may be, as the company, providing information to the service provider so that they can do their job. That would be a unilateral agreement. Multilateral would be if they are also providing me with confidential information in the course of that. So both parties are providing confidential information. And then multilateral means there are multiple parties, more than two, that all or some part of which may be providing confidential information. So really, when it comes to type with NDAs, we're just talking about who is providing the confidential information to whom and what does that relationship look like. Every time I try to transition in between sections, I'm tempted to say the exact same thing. I need a catchphrase. That's what I'm deciding the longer that I do this podcast. So if you have ideas for catchphrases for me, appropriate ideas, ladies and gentlemen, because I know the people that are listening to this podcast, feel free to leave them in the comments on social media. I would love to hear some ideas. Maybe I'll throw some out in the next episode if you leave them out there. So let's talk quickly about enforcement. We understand what an NDA is, what it's supposed to do, how it functions, what types there are. We've covered all of our bases. But at the end of the day, just like any other written document, it's really only as good as the extent to which you're willing to enforce it. And just like other documents we've talked about and other documents we'll talk about in the future, there are really two camps of thought on this. One camp is going to tell you they're not really worth it. Going to court, having to litigate all of this, proving damages is going to be time consuming, it's going to be costly, and if someone wants to steal from you, they're going to steal from you. The other camp is obviously the other side of the spectrum, that it's important to create a paper trail. Maybe you won't use it all the time, but maybe there will be an instance when you want to have that paper trail and you want to have the right to enforce an NDA. And both camps have their merits. But when it comes down to actual enforcement, the fact of the matter is we get into the same situation that we saw with non-compete agreements, and that is you have two options: send a letter or take someone to court. Send a letter and say, hey, here's a copy of your NDA. You signed it. You weren't supposed to give away XYZ information. I have reason to believe that you gave away X, Y, and Z information. Stop doing that and pay me X amount of money for the damage that you've already caused. In the event they don't listen to that, which sometimes people do, sometimes they don't, then you do actually have to take them to court to enforce an NDA. There's no way around that. So recognizing that going into it, I think, is also important, because if you have no intention or interest in ever enforcing an NDA in court, then it is a limiting document inherently. So keep that in the back of your mind. You know, the paper itself does carry some weight in terms of potentially intimidating people you're doing business with, for better or worse, which is also why people are generally advised to tread carefully when handing out NDAs, because some people don't want to be limited in that way. And it's not because they intend to steal from you. It's just because in the 21st century, like I said, people just run their mouths. Ironically, I'm talking about running your mouth as I record a podcast, but people just run their mouths. And so some people don't want to be tied down and accidentally violate an NDA, which could be a very real thing. But if you're in a situation, if you're thinking about having someone sign an NDA and you want to know what your options are, court. A letter, potentially, you can hope that that works, but really your last and final course of action is taking it to court and trying to enforce it there. So keep that in mind, because while court is a great option in certain circumstances, camp one is right in saying that it is time consuming and it is not always the most cost effective decision you can make for your business. So that's something to keep in mind as you decide whether an NDA is right for you and your business or not. So when I was looking for a case study this week, like I said at the beginning, it was pretty easy to find a number of non-disclosure examples in modern times, because especially in the past 5 years, non-disclosure agreements are starting to have some public backlash, because a lot of the situations that we're hearing they've been used in, high profile cases, things like that, there has been an abuse of a non-disclosure agreement and what it's intended to do. So there were a lot of options to choose from, needless to say, but what I decided to go with, I do want to give a trigger warning for anyone who doesn't want to listen to a case study related to sexual harassment. Now's probably the time to depart the podcast. But the case study I'm going to be using this week is more general than a specific example. So there has been a lot of talk as the Me Too movement gained popularity, it gained momentum. There were a number of women who came out specifically related to sexual harassment by Harvey Weinstein, but also in other scenarios, who said they didn't feel that they had the ability to talk about what had happened to them because they had signed rather complex and extensive NDAs as part of a settlement agreement with their alleged or convicted harasser. So as part of that conversation, there has been a question popping up in the legal community and in the court system as to whether there are situations related to potentially sensitive topics like sexual harassment where the enforceability and validity of an otherwise valid non-disclosure may be called into question. We just spent 20 minutes talking about what makes a non-disclosure agreement valid, and now the court system and the legal profession generally are kind of grappling with the question of, are there specific sensitive situations where maybe those general rules don't apply? And one of the arguments that's been made in relation to non-disclosures in those types of situations is looking at whether that provision or that agreement is actually unconscionable. And what unconscionability means essentially is that one party was in one way or another coerced into signing the agreement. So either there was an extreme disparity of bargaining power, there was an abuse of authority aspect that's coming into play, they were in fear of their career, their life, etc., whatever the situation may be. And does that subsequently make that NDA invalid? And what does that do to the entire settlement agreement? So I think that's an interesting question. It's definitely signals a change of the times, as we've seen in the business community and, just society in general in the past. Like I said, this isn't a political podcast, but it's important to know from an NDA standpoint, from a legal technicality standpoint, in what situations can NDAs be effectively used to address situations that you may encounter in the business world, and in what situations can't they? And while this question is really being applied to sexual harassment right now, anytime you apply an exception like unconscionability to the enforceability or validity of a provision, it potentially has other consequences that are outside of the scope of that specific situation. So it's something we're going to watch. It's something that I'll keep an eye on. And as the situation progresses, I will definitely keep y'all updated so that you're aware about NDA provisions that you may have in effect. And with that, we've officially come to the end of episode 3. Thank y'all so much for sticking with me. Thank you for listening. Every time we get to the end of one of these, it's such a weird feeling for me because part of me feels like 30 minutes just flies by because we're talking about so much information. But the other part of me is like, wow, what year is it? That meme with Robin Williams coming out with a beard and he's been, I don't know, trapped on an island or something. And he's like, what year is it? That's how I feel sometimes. So at the end of that joke also. So I hope that y'all learned something. Like I said, NDAs especially, we're not talking about abstract legal concepts here. These are things that really apply to your daily life. I work with startups a lot, and these are documents that I encounter on a daily basis, that my clients encounter on a daily basis. It varies a little by industry, but anyone in business will generally be dealing with NDAs at some point. So I hope that we help to translate a little bit and give you a better understanding of really what they are, how they function, and help to show you that they're not just a simple document that you should sign and toss to the wayside. You should be aware of what's in them. You should make sure that they're valid, that you're actually complying with your obligations under them. And as we don't always do in the 21st century, if you have signed a non-disclosure, be careful of what you're saying, especially on the internet. That being said, I hope that we taught you something. I hope you're walking away a little bit smarter with a little more information, and that we hope to translate some of that shit that your lawyer says. And with that, I will talk to you again next Wednesday. I look forward to coming back to y'all with another topic. If you have thoughts, ideas on topics, reach out to us on social media, Shit Your Lawyer Says at Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, or shoot me a message at shityourlawyersays@gmail.com. Also, feel free to connect with me personally on LinkedIn, Jessica Vittorio. Otherwise, I'll be back next week, and I will talk to y'all soon.